Welcome to the Stories for Sleep channel. Don't forget to subscribe and like right away, because by the end of the lecture, you'll be fast asleep. Close your eyes, the story is about to begin. When we hear the name Cleopatra, we immediately envision a vibrant, passionate, and mysterious queen of ancient Egypt. Her life is shrouded in legends and mysteries, filled with high-profile romances, intrigues, and fateful decisions that changed the course of history. But who was the real Cleopatra? A skilled seductress, a brilliant politician, or a victim of complex circumstances? In this lecture, we will embark on a fascinating journey through her life, from the luxurious palaces of Alexandria to the grand battles for power and love. We will learn how this real woman became one of the greatest symbols in world history and why, thousands of years later, her image continues to inspire and intrigue millions. So, let's begin our story from the very start, in the Egypt of the late Ptolemaic era, when Cleopatra VII, the last great queen of the ancient world, came into the world. To understand who Cleopatra was and why her life unfolded as it did, one must take a close look at the Egypt into which she was born and raised. The country was experiencing far from easy times. By the time the future queen was born, the once majestic and powerful civilization of Egypt had already been in a deep decline for several centuries. The history of the Ptolemaic dynasty, to which Cleopatra belonged, began shortly after the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE. Alexander's great empire broke apart into several states, and Egypt fell to Ptolemy, one of Alexander's closest companions and generals. Ptolemy, nicknamed Soter, or Savior, was a Macedonian, a man of non-Egyptian origin. Nevertheless, he quickly gained authority in his new country, successfully blending Greek and ancient Egyptian traditions. Becoming the first pharaoh of the new dynasty, he laid the foundations for the unique society we now call Hellenistic Egypt. The Ptolemies adopted ancient Egyptian rituals, deified themselves as pharaohs, and nurtured culture and science. Under the early Ptolemies, Egypt flourished. The famous Library of Alexandria was founded, magnificent temples were built, and a splendid infrastructure was created that attracted the best philosophers, scholars, and artists of the ancient world to Alexandria. The Egypt of the early Ptolemaic era was a rich, stable, and prosperous state, an important commercial and cultural center of the Mediterranean. However, over time, prosperity gave way to political crisis and dynastic strife. One of the main causes of instability was the tradition of marriage between relatives, brothers and sisters, which generated numerous conflicts, intrigues, and power struggles within the family. Each new generation of Ptolemies faced fierce competition for the throne, which often escalated into bloody massacres, assassinations, and civil wars. In the struggle for power, no one was spared, not brothers, not sisters, not even one's own children. By the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, the once mighty Egypt was already in a deep crisis. The state treasury was rapidly emptying, the army was weakening, and the pharaoh's influence was often limited to the capital city of Alexandria. The country had become an object of influence for a much stronger power, the Roman Republic, which by this time dominated the entire Mediterranean. Egypt formally remained independent, but in reality, its rulers were completely dependent on Roman politicians, diplomats, and military leaders. The relationship between Egypt and Rome was very complex and ambiguous. The Romans understood the strategic and economic importance of Egypt and so actively interfered in its internal affairs, bribing and supporting various representatives of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Egypt became a kind of political arena for the struggles between different Roman factions, and its rulers were forced to pay enormous bribes to Roman politicians to hold on to power. By the time of Cleopatra VI's birth in 69 BC, power in Egypt belonged to her father, Ptolemy XII Auletes. Auletes was not the most successful ruler and was utterly unsuited to govern the country in such difficult conditions. Instead of engaging in politics and strengthening the state, he preferred festivals and entertainment, for which he earned his nickname Auletes, which literally means the flute player. His weakness and inability to govern effectively only worsened the already difficult situation in Egypt. To keep his throne, Ptolemy XII constantly sought support from the Romans, especially from the most influential politicians of the time, such as Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. He spent huge sums bribing the Roman nobility, which further depleted the Egyptian treasury and increased the country's dependence on Rome. The Egyptians were dissatisfied with this state of affairs. Uprisings repeatedly broke out against Ptolemy, which he suppressed with difficulty using Roman troops. After the death of Ptolemy XII, the situation deteriorated even further. Power was supposed to pass to his children, his daughter Cleopatra and his son Ptolemy XIII, who, according to tradition, were to rule jointly. However, instead of an alliance, open war broke out between the brother and sister. The young Ptolemy XIII was merely a pawn in the hands of his court advisors, who hoped to seize power and eliminate the intelligent and ambitious Cleopatra. Soon, she was forced to flee Alexandria and was stripped of her share of power. At the time of Cleopatra's birth, the relationship between Egypt and the Roman Republic was already complex and contradictory, and the country found itself increasingly drawn into Rome's sphere of influence. This was a natural consequence of the fact that, for several centuries before Cleopatra, Egypt had become one of the wealthiest and most economically attractive states in the Mediterranean. The land along the banks of the Nile was famous for its fertility and produced huge grain harvests, which were vital for the growing Roman Republic. The Romans were well aware of Egypt's strategic and economic significance. As early as the end of the 2nd century BC, the Roman Republic began to interfere in Egyptian affairs, acting as an arbiter in power disputes within the Ptolemaic dynasty. The first striking example of such intervention was in 168 BC when the Roman envoy Gaius Popilius Laenas famously drew a circle in the sand around King Antiochus IV and demanded an immediate answer, effectively forcing him to abandon his invasion of Egypt. This event vividly highlighted the growing power of Rome and its influence on the politics of Hellenistic monarchies. By the time of the reign of Ptolemy XII, Cleopatra's father, Egypt's relations with Rome had become even closer and, at the same time, more dangerous. Ptolemy XII elites understood perfectly well that his power depended heavily on the goodwill of influential Roman politicians and generals. This made the Egyptian king practically a puppet in the hands of Roman senators, among whom were such powerful figures as Pompey the Great and Julius Caesar. Ptolemy XII was forced to resort to enormous expenditures to secure the support of influential Roman politicians and keep his throne. As a result, Egypt found itself in a dire financial situation. The treasury was empty, taxes were increased to unbearable levels, and social discontent grew within the country. It was amidst such events that a popular uprising in Alexandria in 58 BC led to the expulsion of Ptolemy XII, who was forced to seek refuge in Rome. Ptolemy Xi's stay in Rome definitively showed his complete dependence on his Roman patrons. To return to power, he literally bought the favor of key Roman politicians, generously handing out bribes and promising huge payments in return. His main patron was Pompey, who facilitated his return to the throne in 55 BC with the help of Roman troops. Upon returning to Egypt, Ptolemy XII continued to pay off his huge debts to Rome, further exacerbating the country's economic crisis. At the same time, Alexandria filled with Roman soldiers and officials, intensifying anti-Roman sentiment among the local population. Thus, by the time of Cleopatra's birth, Egypt was an extremely unstable state, deeply mired in debt, intrigue, and external dependence on Rome. It was under these conditions that in 69 BC, in the royal palace of Alexandria, a girl named Cleopatra VII was born. Alexandria at that time was a magnificent city, the largest center of science and culture in the ancient world, attracting scholars, philosophers, and artists from all over the Mediterranean. But it was also a city of political intrigue and a constant struggle for power. Cleopatra was born and spent her childhood in a palace on the Mediterranean coast, surrounded by a level of luxury and comfort available only to a narrow circle of rulers and nobility. Despite the external splendor, the atmosphere in the palace was far from calm and harmonious. Constant intrigues, the danger of conspiracies, and open conflicts among family members were the norm for any member of the Ptolemaic dynasty. From an early age, Cleopatra understood that belonging to the ruling family was not only a privilege but also a threat to her life. A key feature of Cleopatra's upbringing and education was that, unlike many of her predecessors, she spoke not only Greek but also the Egyptian language fluently. This became one of her most important advantages, allowing her to win the sympathy of ordinary Egyptians and emphasize her connection to the ancient civilization of Egypt. In addition to these languages, Cleopatra studied Latin, Aramaic, Ethiopian, and other languages of the ancient East, and she was also well educated in philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. Cleopatra's childhood was spent in an atmosphere of anxiety and constant uncertainty. From an early age, she saw how her father, trying to maintain power, was completely dependent on his Roman patrons, torn between the interests of his own people and the demands of Roman creditors. Observing these events, Cleopatra quickly learned to appreciate the price of power, the importance of diplomacy, and the need for subtle political games. Cleopatra received one of the finest educations available in the Hellenistic world, which allowed her to go down in history not only as an outstanding ruler but also as one of the most educated women of her time. Her high level of knowledge and skills was the result of the special approach to upbringing that was characteristic of royal families of the Hellenistic era, especially in Egypt. During the Ptolemaic era, royal children were educated with great care and attention. A special emphasis was placed on the study of languages, driven by the multinational composition of Egyptian society and its importance as a cultural and commercial center of the Mediterranean. Cleopatra, unlike many of her predecessors and contemporaries, was fluent not only in Greek, the traditional language of Hellenistic royal courts, but also mastered the Egyptian language, an extremely rare achievement among her relatives, who often ignored the local language and culture. This immediately set her apart from other members of the dynasty and brought her closer to ordinary Egyptians, allowing her to win their sympathy and support. However, Greek and Egyptian were only part of her linguistic repertoire. According to ancient sources, Cleopatra knew about 9 languages. In addition to her native Greek and Egyptian, she was fluent in Latin, which was extremely useful for her future relations with Rome. She also knew Hebrew, Aramaic, Ethiopian, and a number of other Eastern languages spoken in the commercial and diplomatic circles of the time. This allowed her to personally conduct negotiations and diplomatic conversations with foreign ambassadors and rulers without needing interpreters. Besides her outstanding linguistic abilities, Cleopatra received a thorough education in science and philosophy, which was typical for the Hellenistic era, when the aim was to give heirs to the throne the broadest possible worldview. Alexandria, the largest intellectual center of the ancient world, was home to the best teachers, scholars, and philosophers. Surrounded by the famous Library of Alexandria and the Museum, a kind of ancient scientific and educational complex, Cleopatra had the opportunity to study natural sciences, including astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and alchemy, as well as philosophy, rhetoric, poetry, and history. The magnificence of her education was further emphasized by the fact that Alexandria was the largest intellectual hub of the Mediterranean, a center of scientific thought and philosophical debate. At that time, famous Stoic, Platonist, and Neoplatonist philosophers, as well as representatives of other philosophical schools, lived and worked there. Alexandrian scholars were known far beyond Egypt, and the knowledge Cleopatra gained in this intellectual environment was truly priceless. Among her teachers were undoubtedly distinguished philosophers and scholars, experts in ancient texts, and guardians of scientific knowledge. Under their guidance, she studied the works of such ancient authors as Plato, Aristotle, Homer, and Euclid. She was well versed in mathematical and astronomical calculations, could hold her own in complex philosophical discussions, and was thoroughly familiar with ancient Egyptian religious texts, which were an integral part of royal education. Cleopatra took an active interest in medicine and pharmacology, which was particularly valuable during her reign. It is known that she personally studied the properties of medicines and poisons, conducted her own experiments, and could prepare various remedies. This is also linked to some legends that later attributed to her a deep knowledge of poisons, which, according to tradition, she used in her political intrigues. Cleopatra's youth in Alexandria also provided her with a unique opportunity to study politics and diplomacy in practice. The city was not only the cultural and scientific capital of the Mediterranean but also a place of constant political intrigue and diplomatic conflict. From childhood, she observed the complex negotiations of her father, Ptolemy XII, with Roman politicians and diplomats. She saw how alliances were made and broken, and what methods her relatives and courtiers used to achieve power and maintain influence. All of this shaped not only her intellectual qualities but also her political wisdom and caution. Life at the court in Alexandria was filled with constant tension and uncertainty. Political conspiracies, betrayal, and murder were common practice. In this dangerous and complex atmosphere, Cleopatra learned not only sciences and languages but also the art of intrigue, survival tactics, and how to hold on to power. These skills, combined with her high intellect and education, later allowed her to negotiate confidently and effectively with figures like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. The dynastic struggle in Egypt, which began immediately after the death of Ptolemy XII elites in 51 BC, became a serious test for the young Cleopatra. According to her father's will, power formally passed to his eldest daughter, Cleopatra, then about 18 years old, and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was only about 10. Due to her brother's young age, real power fell into the hands of his regents and advisors, among whom the eunuch Pothinus, the general Achilles, and the scholar Theodotus of Chios were particularly prominent. In the first years of their joint rule, relations between Cleopatra and her younger brother's entourage rapidly deteriorated. Cleopatra, seeking to assert her authority, began to make independent political decisions, issue coins with her own image, and sign official documents in her own name without mentioning her brother. Such actions were perceived by Ptolemy XII's supporters as a direct violation of their father's will and an attempt to usurp the throne. The young king's advisors, especially Pothinus, who effectively controlled the government on his behalf, soon began to actively oppose Cleopatra. They spread rumors, accusing her of excessive independence and of being a threat to Egypt's stability. In 49 BC, the political confrontation reached its peak, and Cleopatra was forced to leave Alexandria. Fearing for her life, she fled to Syria. There, securing the support of the local nobility, she began to assemble an army to return to the throne. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, Ptolemy XII's supporters declared Cleopatra deposed, completely removing her name from official documents. However, the internal political situation in Egypt remained unstable. Shortly after Cleopatra's exile, another member of the royal house, her younger sister Arsinophore, also entered the struggle, laying her own claim to the throne. Thus, Egypt was plunged into a complex conflict between several factions, each trying to strengthen its influence and seize power. At this critical moment, in 48 BC, Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt. His arrival was linked to dramatic events in Rome. After his defeat at Pharsalus, Caesar's main rival, Pompey the Great, arrived in Alexandria, hoping to find refuge and support from the Egyptian rulers. However, on the orders of Pothinus and Ptolemy XII's advisors, Pompey was treacherously murdered immediately upon his arrival on the Egyptian shore. Caesar, who arrived in Alexandria shortly after, was deeply outraged by this act, considering it a humiliation and an insult to Rome. Upon arriving in Alexandria, Caesar was immediately drawn into the dynastic conflict. It was crucial for the Roman general to maintain stability in Egypt, which supplied Rome with grain. Therefore, Caesar decided to intervene and acted as an arbiter, demanding that Cleopatra be returned to Alexandria and that joint rule with her brother Ptolemy XIII be restored, strictly following their father's will. However, Ptolemy XII's supporters refused to comply with Caesar's demands and began active military operations against the Romans and Cleopatra. As a result, a civil war broke out in Alexandria, known in history as the Alexandrian War. Caesar, finding himself surrounded by hostile forces, was forced to mount a difficult defense with limited resources and a small garrison of Roman soldiers. The fighting continued for several months, accompanied by serious destruction in and around the city. During the conflict, many buildings were damaged, including part of the Library of Alexandria, although the extent of the damage is still a subject of scholarly debate. During this time, Ptolemy's supporters proclaimed his younger sister, Arsinoe IV, as the new queen, which further complicated the situation. However, after several months of intense fighting, Caesar and his allies managed to inflict a decisive defeat on Ptolemy XII's forces at the Battle of the Nile. The young king then died, drowning in the river while trying to flee, and Arsinoe IV was taken prisoner. After the war ended, Caesar, acting strictly within the framework of Ptolemy XII's will, officially restored the joint rule of Cleopatra with her other younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, who was then about 12 years old. However, all power was effectively concentrated in the hands of Cleopatra, who, thanks to Caesar's support, was able to strengthen her position and restore stability to the country. The famous story of how Cleopatra secretly reached Julius Caesar by hiding in a carpet has long become part of our cultural heritage, inspiring numerous works of art, films, and theatrical productions. However, the historical accuracy of this story raises many questions. The earliest and most detailed source describing this episode belongs to the Greek historian Plutarch, who lived almost 100 years after the events themselves. According to his account, Cleopatra, fearing her enemies, decided to meet Caesar secretly and used an unusual method to do so. Her loyal supporter, a Sicilian merchant named Apollodorus, wrapped her in a carpet and carried her past the guards, straight into the Roman general's quarters. When the carpet was unrolled, the Egyptian queen herself, beautiful, intelligent, and daring, appeared before the astonished Caesar. However, modern historians suggest that the carpet episode is more of a symbolic or literary device than a real event. Plutarch was not a witness to these events and based his account on stories that may have been embellished for dramatic effect. Nevertheless, historians agree that the meeting itself could have indeed happened secretly, as there was an intense power struggle in Alexandria at the time, and it was dangerous for the queen, who was officially in exile, to appear openly. Thus, the carpet story reflects not so much a literal truth as Cleopatra's ability to act unconventionally in a crisis. As for the circumstances of the first meeting between Cleopatra and Caesar, it took place at the end of 48 BC in Alexandria, where Caesar had arrived in pursuit of his defeated rival, Pompey the Great. As we mentioned earlier, Pompey was killed on the orders of the advisors of the Egyptian king Ptolemy XIII, who hoped to please Caesar. However, the murder of a Roman politician provoked not approval but outrage from Caesar, and he decided to personally intervene in Egyptian affairs, acting as an arbiter between the rival parties. At this critical moment, Cleopatra decided to seek a personal meeting with Caesar, understanding that only his direct support could restore her to power and ensure victory over her enemies. Although the details of the meeting are known mainly through literary and indirect sources, it is clear that this meeting took place and had a decisive influence on the course of subsequent events. According to all historical accounts, Julius Caesar was not only impressed but also genuinely intrigued by Cleopatra's personality, her intellect, and her political acumen. This brings us to one of the most complex and interesting questions: was the connection between Cleopatra and Caesar purely a political alliance, or were there genuine personal feelings between them? Clearly, the alliance between Cleopatra and Caesar was deeply political. The queen needed the protection and support of the powerful Roman, who could restore her to the Egyptian throne. At the same time, for Caesar, Egypt was a strategically important region that supplied Rome with grain and wealth. An alliance with Cleopatra allowed him to ensure stability in Egypt and solidify Roman influence there. However, many ancient authors, including Plutarch, noted that the relationship between Cleopatra and Caesar was not exclusively calculating and formal. They claimed that Caesar was captivated by the Egyptian queen not only as a political ally but also as a woman. This is evidenced by the fact that Cleopatra soon moved into the royal quarters where Caesar was staying, which was a serious breach of Roman traditions and caused much gossip among Roman soldiers and officers. Later, after his return to Rome, Caesar housed Cleopatra in his villa on the banks of the Tiber, which also underscored the informal nature of their relationship. Another strong argument for the personal nature of the relationship between Cleopatra and Caesar was the birth of their son, Ptolemy XV Caesarion. The very fact of the son's birth and Caesar's acknowledgement of him as his heir, albeit unofficially, suggests that the Roman general regarded Cleopatra not just as a political partner but also as someone close to him. And although Roman laws and traditions officially did not permit Caesar to recognize a son by a foreign queen, the appearance of Caesarion became a powerful symbol of the union between Egypt and Rome and, simultaneously, a source of new political complications. Nevertheless, even considering the romantic component of this relationship, it is important to understand that both Caesar and Cleopatra remained, above all, outstanding politicians. Their connection was part of a broader political game in which both partners pursued their own strategic goals. Cleopatra sought to strengthen her power in Egypt and secure the support of the most powerful Roman politician of the time. Caesar, in turn, hoped to increase his influence in the East and use Egypt as a vital resource in his grandiose plans to transform the Roman Republic. Julius Caesar's stay in Egypt lasted for about 9 months, from October 48 BC to June 47 BCE. This period proved to be pivotal in Cleopatra's life, as it gave her the opportunity to fully reveal her political talents and confirm her status as the legitimate ruler of Egypt. After the conclusion of military operations and the stabilization of the situation in Alexandria, Cleopatra actively assisted Caesar in resolving Egypt's internal political issues and in negotiations with the local nobility, priesthood, and officials. Her deep understanding of the local culture and her command of the Egyptian language and traditions significantly eased Caesar's role as a mediator and peacemaker. Cleopatra did not limit herself to the role of a queen standing in the shadow of the Roman general. She was an independent and active leader. Using her influence among the Egyptians, she helped to soften resistance to the Roman presence and stabilize public opinion. The Egyptians, concerned about the prospect of losing their independence completely, saw in the alliance of Cleopatra and Caesar a guarantee for preserving their traditional way of life and the stability of the state. One of the most important aspects of Cleopatra's activities during Caesar's stay in Egypt was her ability to demonstrate her own legitimacy and power to both Egyptians and Romans. She actively used traditional Egyptian symbols and rituals to strengthen her position as the heiress of an ancient civilization and the defender of Egyptian traditions. At the same time, Cleopatra tried to prevent the complete subjugation of her country to Rome, striving to build an equal partnership. The birth of Caesarion. The most significant event associated with Caesar's stay in Egypt was the birth of Cleopatra's son, whom she named Ptolemy, but who went down in history as Caesarion, literally Little Caesar. He was born on June 23, 47 BC, during the very last period of Caesar's stay in Alexandria. The birth of a child by the Roman leader was an event of exceptional importance, both for Cleopatra personally and for her political ambitions. Although Julius Caesar never officially recognized Caesarion as his son or made him his heir under Roman law, the birth of Caesarion was of immense significance to Cleopatra herself. Her son became not only a symbol of the union between Egypt and Rome but also an important tool for strengthening her own power and authority. From the moment of his birth, Caesarion became a crucial element of Cleopatra's political strategy, the embodiment of her hopes and aspirations. The fate of Caesarion is exceptionally important for understanding Cleopatra's politics and personality, as it clearly demonstrates her ambition and foresight. In her son, she saw the continuation of her own dynasty and the opportunity to create a new political reality that could protect Egypt from being completely absorbed by Rome. Thus, the arrival of Caesarion was not just a personal event but a turning point that determined the direction of the Egyptian queen's entire subsequent life and policy. It was in him that Cleopatra's hopes and aspirations for creating a long-term and stable alliance with the most influential state of the ancient world were embodied. After Julius Caesar concluded his affairs in Egypt, Cleopatra soon followed him to Rome, arriving there around 46 BCE. She spent about 2 years in the capital of the Roman Republic, until Caesar's assassination in March of 44 BCE. Cleopatra's stay in Rome generated enormous interest and became the cause of much talk, rumor, and gossip among the Roman nobility and common citizens. Cleopatra settled in one of Caesar's luxurious villas, located in the prestigious area across the Tiber River known as Trastevere. The very presence of a foreign queen in the villa of the most powerful man in Rome provoked a mixed reaction. On one hand, the Romans were curious about the mysterious Eastern queen. On the other, such proximity deeply troubled the conservative circles of Roman society, as Caesar was formally married to Calpurnia. The Romans saw this relationship as a threat to traditional foundations and moral norms. Although Cleopatra officially held no political position in Rome, her influence on public opinion was noticeable. She hosted receptions where she introduced the Roman elite to the culture and art of Egypt, emphasizing the greatness and antiquity of her country. Cleopatra's exotic appearance, education, and charm made her popular among a segment of the Roman nobility, while simultaneously provoking envy and hostility from those who considered her a foreign threat. Numerous rumors quickly formed around the figure of the Egyptian queen, often without any real basis. Among the most widespread and popular were claims that Caesar was planning to move the capital of the Republic from Rome to Alexandria, marry Cleopatra, and even officially recognize Caesarion as his heir. However, reliable historical sources do not confirm these plans, and modern historians believe that such rumors were part of a propaganda campaign directed against Caesar and Cleopatra, rather than a reflection of the Roman general's actual intentions. Nevertheless, Cleopatra's stay in Rome was abruptly cut short by tragic events. On March 15, 44 BC, on the day that went down in history as the Ides of March, Caesar was assassinated by conspirators led by Brutus and Cassius in the Curia of Pompey. For Cleopatra, this event was a severe political and personal blow. She not only lost her strongest political patron but also found herself in a situation of complete uncertainty and danger. After Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra realized that her position in Rome had become extremely vulnerable. She did not leave the city immediately, but soon decided to return to Egypt with her son Caesarion. This was a completely logical decision, as without Caesar's support, she had nothing left to do in Rome. Upon returning to Egypt, the queen faced a new series of political challenges that required a swift and cautious response. Cleopatra's return to Egypt after the death of Julius Caesar in the spring of 44 BC marked the beginning of a new phase of her reign, full of uncertainty and political challenges. Having lost her strongest ally, Cleopatra was faced with the urgent need to strengthen her position within the country and to determine her strategy for interacting with Rome amidst the power struggle that had begun there. Shortly after her return to Alexandria, under circumstances that historians consider highly suspicious, her younger brother and former co-ruler, Ptolemy XIV, died. Although there is no direct evidence of Cleopatra's involvement in his death, ancient and modern sources often mention speculation that she might have arranged or contributed to his demise to consolidate her power and secure the succession for her son, Caesarion. The death of Ptolemy cleared the way for solving an important political task. Cleopatra proclaimed her son Caesarion as Ptolemy XV, the new co-ruler of Egypt. In this way, she was able to stabilize the internal situation and enhance her own legitimacy on the throne, ensuring the continuity of the Ptolemaic dynasty. However, even after strengthening her power within the country, Cleopatra had to solve the most difficult foreign policy issue, relations with Rome after Caesar's death. Following the dictator's assassination, a brutal power struggle began in the Republic, and among its main participants was Mark Antony, a man whose role and influence in Rome rose sharply during this period. Mark Antony was born around 83 BC into a noble Roman family and distinguished himself from an early age as a talented and brave military leader. He possessed a charismatic personality and enjoyed immense popularity among soldiers, but at the same time, he provoked a mixed reaction in the Senate due to his impulsive character and penchant for excess and luxury. Antony was one of Julius Caesar's closest associates and confidants. He participated in his campaigns, held important command posts, and proved himself a reliable ally to the dictator. After Caesar's murder, Antony quickly became one of the key leaders of the Caesarian faction, opposing the conspirators led by Brutus and Cassius. In 43 BC, he formed the Second Triumvirate, an alliance with Caesar's official heir, Octavian, and the general Lepidus. Together, they defeated their opponents and divided the spheres of influence in the Republic among themselves. Under this agreement, it was Antony who gained control over Rome's eastern provinces, which effectively made him the chief representative of Roman authority for Egypt and neighboring territories. For Cleopatra, the figure of Antony was particularly important. Having lost Caesar, she understood that her future largely depended on whether she could establish strong political and diplomatic relations with the new influential Roman leader. To this end, Cleopatra sought to establish contact specifically with Antony, who controlled the eastern Roman territories and could provide her with the necessary support and protection. Their first personal meeting took place in 41 BC in the city of Tarsus in Asia Minor. This meeting proved fateful for both Cleopatra and Antony, becoming the beginning of a personal and political alliance that would for many years determine not only the destiny of the Egyptian queen but also the history of Rome and the entire Mediterranean. Thus, after returning to Egypt, Cleopatra once again found herself at the center of complex political events that required her to use the most subtle diplomacy and make quick decisions. The death of her brother and the subsequent proclamation of Caesarion as co-ruler strengthened her internal position, while the appearance of Mark Antony on the political stage opened a new chapter in her political activity, on the success of which the future of Egypt now depended. The meeting of Cleopatra and Mark Antony in Tarsus in the summer of 41 BC became one of the most famous and spectacular episodes of ancient history, described in detail by the Greek historian Plutarch. Although his account is considered somewhat dramatized and literarily embellished, the historical core of this meeting is undeniable. The Egyptian queen sought to make a brilliant impression on the influential Roman general and politician, understanding that an alliance with him was necessary to strengthen her power and preserve Egypt's independence after the death of Julius Caesar. Cleopatra meticulously planned her arrival in Tarsus, turning it into a memorable theatrical performance. According to Plutarch, she appeared before Antony on a magnificent ship with purple sails and rich decorations. The ship itself was plated with gold and encrusted with precious jewels. The Egyptian queen deliberately presented herself in the guise of the goddess Aphrodite, thereby emphasizing her divine and regal nature, capable of enchanting and inspiring the powerful Roman. Following Cleopatra's arrival, a lavish reception was held in Tarsus, accompanied by solemn feasts and numerous entertainments that demonstrated the wealth and power of Egypt. This reception made a profound impression on Antony and his entourage. And although ancient sources may have somewhat exaggerated the degree of luxury and splendor, the grand nature of the meeting itself is not in doubt. The outcome of the meeting was the formation of an alliance between Cleopatra and Antony, which from the very beginning was both personal and political. On a personal level, a close relationship developed between the two leaders, which grew into a long-lasting love affair, strengthening their trust and mutual understanding. On a political level, the alliance gave Cleopatra a guarantee of protection for Egypt and its interests in the face of the powerful Roman state. Antony, in turn, gained the ability to use the wealth and resources of Egypt to support his military and political ambitions in the east. Their alliance had significant consequences for the Mediterranean, as it substantially altered the balance of power in the region. Egypt once again gained the opportunity to actively participate in regional politics and strengthened its economic and political influence. Antony, thanks to the alliance with Cleopatra, was able to consolidate his control over the eastern provinces, receiving the resources necessary for his future military campaigns and the strengthening of his political influence. It should also be noted that the relationship between Antony and Cleopatra fostered cultural exchange between Egypt and Rome. Although the scale of this influence should not be exaggerated, there is no doubt that Egyptian culture became more visible and popular in Roman society, arousing curiosity and interest among the Roman nobility. At the same time, Roman influences also appeared in Egyptian culture, especially in the elite circles of Alexandria, reflecting the mutual interpenetration and convergence of the two greatest civilizations of the ancient world. Thus, the meeting in Tarsus and the subsequent alliance between Cleopatra and Mark Antony had a notable impact on the political and cultural processes of the Mediterranean. This alliance determined the future course of the region's history, making both of its participants key figures of the ancient world and leaving behind a significant cultural and historical legacy. The relationship between Cleopatra and Mark Antony was not just a personal union of two vibrant and influential personalities of the ancient world, but also a significant political alliance designed to strengthen and consolidate the positions of both rulers on the complex and ever-changing geopolitical stage of the Mediterranean. Their life together resulted in the birth of 3 children, who symbolized the aspiration to create a unified dynasty capable of combining the wealth and ancient traditions of Egypt with the power and authority of Rome. The first children of Cleopatra and Antony were born in 40 BC in Alexandria. They were twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene II. Their names were filled with deep symbolic meaning. Alexander was given the nickname Helios, which means sun, and his sister was named Selene, meaning moon. Such names were intended to emphasize not only the royal status of the children but also their special destiny in the ancient world. For years later, in 36 BC, another son was born, Ptolemy Philadelphus, whose name also carried deep symbolism, referring to the ancient traditions of the Ptolemaic dynasty. An important event that underscored the seriousness of Antony and Cleopatra's ambitions was the famous ceremony that went down in history as the Donations of Alexandria. During this ceremony, held in 34 BC in Alexandria, Antony officially distributed territories under his control or subject to his claims among the children. Alexander Helios was solemnly proclaimed king of Armenia, Media, and Parthia, although Antony did not actually control all of these territories completely. Cleopatra Selene II received the title of ruler of Cyrenaica and Libya, making her one of the influential figures in North Africa. The youngest son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, was declared ruler of Syria, Phoenicia, and Cilicia, strategically important provinces in the eastern Mediterranean. Particularly significant was Antony's decision to officially recognize Caesar Ion, Cleopatra's eldest son by Julius Caesar, as the legitimate and direct heir of Caesar, bestowing upon him the title King of Kings. This step was not just a symbolic gesture. It had important political consequences, as it directly positioned Caesar Ion against Octavian, Caesar's official heir by will. Such actions by Antony and Cleopatra had deep political meaning and became one of the most important reasons for the growing tension between Antony and Octavian. The Propaganda War. After the assassination of Caesar, both politicians were forced to cooperate temporarily within the Second Triumvirate to defeat the conspirators led by Brutus and Cassius. But after the victory over their common enemies, their alliance became increasingly tense and unstable. The main cause of the conflict was the desire of both leaders to strengthen their own positions and assert their primacy in the Roman state. A critical moment for the deterioration of their relationship was Antony's personal and diplomatic move, his official divorce from Octavia, Octavian's sister, and his open alliance with Cleopatra. This action caused outrage in Rome, as it was perceived as a personal insult to Octavian and a disregard for Roman traditions and moral norms. This allowed Antony's opponents in Rome to openly accuse him of having lost his independence, succumbing to the influence of the Egyptian queen, and now placing the interests of Egypt above the interests of the Roman state. Octavian managed to exploit these sentiments in Roman society, launching a propaganda campaign against Antony and Cleopatra. Special attention was paid to the donations of Alexandria, which in the eyes of the Romans looked like an attempt to create a new dynasty capable of claiming power not only in the East but also in Rome itself. The very idea that the heir of the great Caesar could be the son of a foreign queen caused deep indignation among many Romans, who placed traditional Roman values and national pride above the personal ambitions of individual leaders. Thus, the children of Cleopatra and Antony, conceived as a symbol and guarantee of the political union between Egypt and Rome, unwittingly found themselves at the epicenter of the tension that was growing between the two most powerful political leaders of the time. Their birth and subsequent endowment with titles and territories became not just a demonstration of power but also a catalyst for a political crisis that influenced the entire subsequent history of the Mediterranean. It was around their status and inheritance rights that the most acute questions arose, which eventually led to an even greater escalation of the conflict between Antony and Octavian. After the disagreements between Mark Antony and Octavian reached a critical point, the latter began a carefully prepared propaganda campaign directed against Antony and especially against Cleopatra. Octavian, a talented politician, clearly understood that open criticism of the popular Roman general Antony would not be as effective as accusations against a foreign queen, who could easily be portrayed as a dangerous enemy threatening Roman traditions and morals. That is why Cleopatra became the main target of a powerful information war launched in Rome. Octavian's propaganda deliberately created an extremely negative image of the Egyptian queen. Cleopatra was depicted as a treacherous and greedy Eastern seductress who had subjugated Antony and turned him into a helpless slave of her ambitions. Rumors were actively spread in society that Antony had completely turned away from Roman ideals, spending his days in the luxury of the Alexandrian palace, forgetting about the soldiers and the common people who had believed in him and trusted him with their fate. The Romans were particularly susceptible to such accusations, as to them, a foreign queen seeking to capture the heart and mind of a popular general was a symbol of danger to national independence and traditional values. Octavian skillfully seized the moment, emphasizing the ceremony of the donations of Alexandria, during which Antony distributed lands and titles to Cleopatra's children, including Caesar's son, Caesarion, who was declared king of kings and heir to Caesar himself. As we have already discussed, this act was presented in Rome as a direct threat to the Roman heritage and a personal insult to Octavian, who was officially Julius Caesar's heir by will. Thus, many Romans were convinced that the alliance between Antony and Cleopatra was not just a romantic affair, but a real threat to Rome. By skillfully manipulating public opinion, Octavian secured the Senate's official right to declare war not on Antony himself, but specifically on Cleopatra and Egypt. This approach was strategically calculated. It allowed the conflict to be framed not as a civil war, but as a struggle against a foreign enemy. War was declared on Egypt in 32 BC, and this decision garnered the support of the majority of Roman citizens, allowing Octavian to secure broad popularity and assemble a powerful army. The culmination of this conflict was the famous Battle of Actium, which took place on September 2, 31 BC, off the coast of Greece. This battle became a turning point in the history of the ancient Mediterranean and completely changed the political landscape. The armies and fleets of both sides prepared for the decisive clash with particular care. The fleet of Antony and Cleopatra consisted of several hundred ships, including powerful, heavy vessels on which their main hopes rested. Octavian, however, had lighter and more maneuverable ships commanded by the experienced General Agrippa, who had an excellent understanding of naval battle tactics. From the beginning of the battle, the situation was ambiguous, but it gradually became clear that Agrippa's light and fast ships were superior to Antony's heavy and slow vessels. In the heat of the battle, something unexpected happened. Cleopatra's ships, carrying a significant portion of the Egyptian troops, suddenly left the battlefield and headed for the open sea. This caused panic and confusion among Antony's fleet. Seeing the queen's departure, Antony followed her, abandoning his soldiers to their fate. His departure effectively decided the outcome of the battle. Antony's forces, left without a commander, were defeated, and Octavian celebrated a decisive victory. The fall of Alexandria and the death of Antony. The defeat at Actium was a severe blow to Antony's reputation as a general and leader. Upon returning to Alexandria, he faced a huge psychological and moral crisis. It became clear to Antony that he had lost not only his army and the support of his allies but also the trust of his own people. A sense of despair and doom gradually grew in Alexandria, as everyone understood that the fall of the city and the loss of Egypt's independence were only a matter of time. During the winter of 31 to 30 BC, Octavian gradually captured all the territories previously under the control of Antony and Cleopatra. In the spring of 30 BC, his army appeared at the walls of Alexandria. The besieged city experienced growing food shortages. The soldiers' morale plummeted, and Antony's attempts to rally his remaining forces were fruitless. Antony's final days were filled with despair and the realization of his complete defeat. In August of 30 BC, he received a false report of Cleopatra's death, which finally broke him. In a state of deep depression and grief, he decided to take his own life. Antony threw himself on his sword but did not die immediately. The wounded general was taken to Cleopatra's refuge, where he died in her arms, surrounded by his last allies and confidants. After the defeat at the Battle of Actium and the subsequent tragic death of Mark Antony, Cleopatra was left completely alone in Alexandria to face the victorious Octavian. The final days of the legendary Egyptian queen were filled with deep anxiety, despair, and attempts to find a dignified way out of a hopeless situation. Octavian, who had become the de facto ruler of the Mediterranean, understood the significance of Cleopatra's figure and sought to use her as a triumphal trophy in Rome. He wanted to parade her in chains through the streets of the Roman capital, thereby demonstrating his ultimate supremacy to the world. However, for Cleopatra, such humiliation was utterly unacceptable. She was more willing to die than to become a living symbol of defeat and shame. Despite the approaching Roman troops and the complete loss of hope for salvation, Cleopatra for some time tried to find diplomatic ways out of the crisis. According to ancient authors, she even attempted to negotiate with Octavian himself, trying to secure mercy for her children and preserve some autonomy for Egypt. However, these attempts were unsuccessful. Octavian was not going to make concessions, as his main goal was the complete conquest of Egypt and the assertion of his absolute power. Realizing that fate had finally turned against her, Cleopatra began to prepare for the inevitable. She spent the last days of her life in seclusion in the palace in Alexandria, surrounded only by her most loyal servants. Ancient sources mention that her psychological state was severe, but at the same time, she maintained her royal dignity and majesty until the very end. One of the queen's main concerns in these days was the fate of her children, especially her eldest son Caesarion, the only surviving child of Julius Caesar, in whom she had placed special hopes. Cleopatra's suicide has become one of the most famous and debated events in ancient history, giving rise to numerous legends and disputes among historians. The main sources from which we learn about this dramatic finale are the works of Plutarch, Dio Cassius, and Strabo. These authors agree on the main point: Cleopatra chose death over humiliating captivity and the subsequent public triumph of Octavian in Rome. However, the details and circumstances of her death are described differently, which has led to numerous debates about how the Egyptian queen actually took her own life. The most common and famous version is that Cleopatra committed suicide with the bite of a poisonous snake, an asp. According to Plutarch, a basket of fruit was secretly delivered to Cleopatra, in which a snake was hidden, and the queen voluntarily allowed the snake to bite her. This version, thanks to its dramatic and symbolic character, has become classic and is firmly entrenched in world culture, art, and literature. However, modern historians view this version with considerable skepticism. The reason is that a snake bite, especially from an Egyptian Egyptian cobra, does not always lead to a quick and peaceful death. The bite of this snake causes severe pain, convulsions, and agonizing suffering, which hardly corresponds to the image of a calm and dignified departure described by ancient authors. Therefore, many researchers believe that the snake version may have been deliberately invented or embellished by the ancient authors themselves to give Cleopatra's death a symbolic meaning. In Egyptian culture, the snake was closely associated with royal power and divinity. There are other hypotheses about Cleopatra's death, less known to the general public but actively discussed in the scientific community. In particular, some historians believe that Cleopatra may have died from poison, but not from a snake bite, but from a specially prepared potent substance. It is known that Egypt had deep knowledge in the field of toxicology, and the queen could well have used a poison of plant or mineral origin that would ensure a quick and relatively painless death. Another version suggests that Cleopatra may have died as a result of voluntarily taking a mixture of poisons, prepared in advance and delivered by her servants. This hypothesis is supported by the fact that the snake itself was not found in the palace after Cleopatra's death, which surprised even her contemporaries. Nevertheless, regardless of the specific method of suicide, Cleopatra's motivation remains the main point. She chose a dignified death over shame and humiliation, thereby preserving her royal dignity and remaining in history as the greatest woman of the ancient world. Her death became a powerful symbol not only of the tragic fall of Egypt but also of the end of an entire era, the demise of the last great Hellenistic state and the final triumph of Rome in the Mediterranean. After the tragic death of Cleopatra, Egypt ceased to be an independent state, becoming a Roman province under the direct control of Octavian Augustus. But along with questions about the fate of Egypt, the new ruler was faced with the question of the fate of the children of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, who were now the heirs of the losing side and unwilling hostages of a new political reality. At the time of her death, Cleopatra had 4 children, her eldest son Caesarion, the only heir of Julius Caesar, and 3 children by Mark Antony, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and the younger son Ptolemy Philadelphus. For Octavian, these children represented a serious political problem because, possessing the name and legacy of their parents, they could potentially become a center of opposition to the new Roman power. The fate of Cleopatra's eldest son, Caesarion, was the most tragic and quickly decided. Understanding that Caesarion, as the son of Julius Caesar, was a direct threat to his own legitimacy as heir, Octavian ordered the young man's execution. Caesarion was killed shortly after his mother's death in 30 BC, which completely eliminated the possibility of reviving claims to the throne of either Egypt or Rome through the heir of the great Caesar. However, the fate of the younger children of Cleopatra and Antony was different. Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus were taken captive and brought to Rome. There, they were displayed as trophies in the famous triumphal procession organized by Octavian to celebrate the victory over Egypt. This event was difficult and humiliating for the children, who until recently had been considered rulers and heirs of great kingdoms. However, after the triumph, their lives stabilized somewhat. They were placed under the protection of Octavian's sister, Octavia, the former wife of Mark Antony, who, showing mercy, took them in and raised them in her home, surrounding them with care and attention. Historical information about the subsequent fate of the boys, Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus, is extremely scarce. Both youths disappear from historical records shortly after their arrival in Rome. Their ultimate fate remains unknown. It is presumed they may have died at a young age from illness, which was not uncommon at the time, or their later lives simply had no significant political importance and were therefore not recorded in the sources that have survived to us. Their sister, Cleopatra Selene, Cleopatra's only daughter, had a much happier and more significant fate. Having received an excellent education and upbringing in the house of Octavia, she became an important political and dynastic resource for the new Roman order. Around 20 BC, Octavian arranged her marriage to the Numidian king Juba II, a loyal ally of Rome and a man of high culture and education. Together they became the rulers of Mauritania, a Roman client state in northwestern Africa. Cleopatra Selene managed to use the opportunity given to her with honor and dignity, becoming a significant political figure and an influential queen of her time. Together with Juba II, she actively developed their kingdom, turning it into a prosperous state where elements of Roman, Greek, and Egyptian culture were combined. Cities, libraries, temples, and palaces were built in Mauritania, and Cleopatra Selene herself continued the traditions of Hellenistic monarchies by patronizing science and the arts. It is thanks to Cleopatra Selene that the legacy of the Egyptian Queen Cleopatra and the great general Mark Antony did not completely disappear. Their daughter not only preserved the memory of her parents but also put into practice their ambitions and aspirations to create a prosperous and educated society at the intersection of cultures. Cleopatra Selene lived and ruled for a long time. Her reign lasted until about 5 CE. After her death, the dynasty was continued by her son Ptolemy, named after his mother's ancient lineage, who became the last king of Mauritania before its final transformation into a Roman province. Thus, after Cleopatra's death, her children found themselves in very different life circumstances, from the tragic death of Caesarion to the practically unknown fate of his brothers and the brilliant political career of his sister. Their lives are a vivid reflection of a turbulent and dramatic era when the destinies of individuals were closely intertwined with the history of entire states and cultures. And if the fate of Egypt and Cleopatra herself ended in tragedy, then through her daughter, Cleopatra Selene, the influence of the legendary Egyptian queen continued for several more decades, leaving a mark on the history and culture of the ancient Mediterranean. The question of Cleopatra's appearance has remained one of the most discussed and controversial in history for centuries. When it comes to the Queen of Egypt, the imagination of most people paints a picture of an incredibly beautiful and charming woman with an almost magical allure. However, historical evidence and modern research present a more complex and ambiguous picture. Ancient authors who wrote about Cleopatra's appearance are very reserved in their assessments of her beauty. For example, Plutarch, one of the most authoritative biographers of the ancient world, wrote that Cleopatra was not dazzlingly beautiful in the conventional sense. According to him, the queen's appearance was not particularly attractive. However, her unique charm and charisma had an absolutely irresistible effect on men. Plutarch argued that the power of Cleopatra's appeal lay primarily in her intelligence, education, and outstanding oratorical skills. Thanks to these qualities, she could persuade and conquer even the most influential and powerful men of her time, such as Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Modern archaeological finds support Plutarch's opinion. Coins and busts depicting Cleopatra show a woman with quite expressive, but not necessarily ideal, facial features, a long nose, a prominent chin, large expressive eyes. These images contradict modern ideas of classical beauty, but they suggest the queen's strong and willful character. Thus, modern science tends to believe that Cleopatra's charm was based not on perfect looks, but on her personal charisma, inner strength, and ability to make a deep impression on those around her. If the queen's appearance still causes debate, her character, intellect, and ambitions are almost beyond doubt. Cleopatra's contemporaries were unanimous in their assessment of her intellectual abilities and strong character. She received a brilliant education, rare for women of that time, and was fluent in several languages, including Egyptian, Greek, Latin, and even Hebrew. The queen studied philosophy, astronomy, medicine, and literature, and was well versed in political and economic matters, which allowed her to effectively govern a huge and complex state. Her contemporaries noted Cleopatra's extraordinary determination and confidence. Even as a very young woman, she managed to defend her power in the face of fierce dynastic struggles, not afraid to oppose her own brother and influential courtiers. Later, faced with the growing power of Rome, Cleopatra showed remarkable political flexibility and foresight, forming alliances with Caesar and later with Antony, which allowed her to keep Egypt independent from Roman domination for a long time. Contemporaries and historians particularly highlight Cleopatra's unique ability to manage people and achieve the results she needed from them. Cleopatra possessed exceptional charisma, thanks to which she could win over even those who initially treated her with prejudice or hostility. Her meetings with Caesar and Antony are prime examples of how the queen's personality had a decisive influence on the course of events. For instance, the famous story of how Cleopatra secretly reached Caesar wrapped in a carpet vividly demonstrates her courage, ingenuity, and deep understanding of human psychology. This allowed her not only to win the favor of the powerful Roman dictator but also to save her reign. Similarly, her carefully planned meeting with Mark Antony in Tarsus shows her mastery in managing political and personal relationships. Cleopatra did not just impress Antony with her wealth and luxury, she skillfully subordinated him to her interests, convincing him that an alliance with her in Egypt would bring him a significant advantage. Cleopatra also demonstrated outstanding organizational and administrative abilities in governing Egypt. During her reign, the country, despite political difficulties, continued to prosper economically, maintaining its status as the main breadbasket of the Mediterranean. Cleopatra was actively involved in the development of agriculture, trade, and crafts, carried out tax and administrative reforms, and sought to strengthen the military and economic power of her state, understanding the importance of Egypt's economic independence. At the same time, the queen showed flexibility in religious policy, supporting the cult of Egyptian gods and thereby winning the trust and favor of the population. She skillfully used the symbolism and traditions of Egypt, presenting herself as the embodiment of the ancient goddess Isis, which enhanced her authority in the eyes of ordinary Egyptians and secured her broad support within the country. The image of Cleopatra, the Egyptian queen and one of the most influential women of the ancient world, has long gone beyond historical chronicles to become a powerful cultural symbol. Over the centuries, her personality has inspired writers, artists, playwrights, and filmmakers, making her image an integral part of world culture. Cleopatra appeared in art almost immediately after her death, already in antiquity. Ancient Roman poets, particularly Horace and Virgil, mentioned the Egyptian queen in their works, depicting her as a seductive and dangerous Eastern woman capable of subjugating men and entire states. From that moment, her image has been constantly present in European literature and painting, gradually transforming and acquiring new features that correspond to the ideas of each subsequent generation. One of the most significant authors who influenced the popularization of Cleopatra's image was the English playwright William Shakespeare. In his famous play Antony and Cleopatra, Shakespeare created an emotional and vivid portrait of the queen, emphasizing her passion, emotional depth, and tragic fate. It was this romantic, somewhat exotic image that had a huge impact on subsequent generations of writers and artists, turning Cleopatra into a symbol of love, passion, and tragedy. In the painting of the Renaissance and Baroque eras, the image of Cleopatra was actively used by artists to convey drama and luxury. On numerous canvases, Cleopatra was often depicted in dramatic scenes related to her death, emphasizing her tragic and sublime character. Works by masters such as Guido Reni, Titian, and Artemisia Gentileschi show Cleopatra as a woman who is strong, beautiful, and full of dignity, capable of choosing her own destiny even at the cost of her life. Cinema has also had a powerful influence on the romanticization of Cleopatra's image. From the earliest days of cinematography, her image was one of the most sought after. The Hollywood industry, even in the early 20th century, actively used the story of the Egyptian queen, turning it into large-scale cinematic canvases full of exoticism and drama. The 1963 film starring Elizabeth Taylor became particularly famous, being the most expensive film of its time. The movie solidified Cleopatra's image as a woman of extraordinary beauty, strength, and tragedy, who became a hostage of her own love and ambition. But why does the image of Cleopatra continue to be constantly romanticized and idealized? The main reason is the unique combination of qualities in her personality and life story, which has everything needed to create a vivid legend: passionate love, dramatic confrontation, wealth and luxury, political intrigue, and a tragic conclusion. Cleopatra's story combines elements of romance and politics, personal drama and global events, making it attractive to any viewer and reader, regardless of era and culture. Furthermore, Cleopatra is the ideal embodiment of a strong and independent woman, capable of standing up to powerful men and entire empires. In different eras, her image has allowed for a rethinking of the role of women in society, from a femme fatale to a clever and far-sighted politician whose intellect and charisma could conquer the most influential men of the age. This multifaceted nature of her character makes her image universal, allowing new meanings and interpretations to be found each time. The historical significance of Cleopatra for Egypt and the entire ancient world is hard to overestimate. Despite the tragic end of her reign and the subsequent conquest of Egypt by Rome, Cleopatra became a symbol of resistance to foreign power, the last great monarch of an independent Egypt. Thanks to her diplomatic talents, Egypt was able to maintain its independence and wealth longer than any other Hellenistic monarchy, defending its position on the world stage against the most powerful empire of the time, Rome. Cleopatra also symbolizes the end of the Hellenistic era and the transition to a new historical reality, the era of the Roman Empire. With her death, the period of independent states ruled by monarchs of Hellenistic dynasties came to an end, and the process of global Roman integration of the Mediterranean began. Thus, she stands at the turning point of eras, and this gives her personality additional historical and symbolic weight. Culturally, Cleopatra left behind a rich legacy that continues to inspire and attract people's attention over millennia. Her image, having become a part of mass culture, remains not only a subject of study for historians but also an inspiration for numerous works of art, literature, and cinema, invariably evoking admiration and interest around the world.